Since we don't hear much about it, ladies, what was your worst Meet the Mom story?
Story 1. I've met 2 awful moms. My ex-boyfriend's mom was friends with my mother. She's the head oncology nurse at our local hospital. She must have had her crap together, right? I thought this would be great. It was not. Before even meeting her, my truck died, and as it was literally my second day at a new job, I was a little in the hole. Boyfriend says, "No problem, you can borrow mine." Awesome, the day is saved. I get to my crappy retail job and work for a couple of hours. Things are going swimmingly. Then the phone rings, and my manager answers. She listens for a second, makes a weird face, starts to hang up the phone, makes a confused face, and says, "Wait, I think this is for you?" So she hands the phone off to me, and the caller is just swearing up and down about that chunt Smeggy Wolf. I'm confused. I tell her I'm Smeggy Wolf. She then told me that since I'd stolen her son's car, she'd call the police and the sheriff's department. She knew people at both and was pulling strings. What the frick? This is loudly being slur-yelled, so my manager hears the whole thing. She gives me a sympathetic look and says, "I guess you'd better go." So I drive the 30 minutes back to his neighborhood, pick him up at the convenience store a couple blocks away. He drops me off at home, and that's the end of that. No apology, no anything, ever. I now see why I haven't met his mom, even though we'd been dating for months. A few months later, he decided to stop by his house with me there. I'm bracing for impact, but we pull up to the house and she's not there. We walk in and there's the largest bottle of Pravda I've ever seen in my life sitting on the kitchen table. It's very empty. Her car is gone. He says, "Oh no." After a bit of time passes, he tries her cell. Nada. Stepdad is working, doesn't know where she is. It's probably been an hour at this point. He starts calling hospitals, thinking the worst. Nada. More time passes, and she finally pulls up, half on the curb, then oozes inside drunkenly. He starts yelling at her about drinking and driving. She starts yelling at him for not respecting her. She starts swinging. It's bad. I shove him out the door before things can progress. She doesn't recall any of this at all. A few weeks later, my ex and I were at his place, chilling, watching movies or something. She comes home, waves at me, hands me a condom, and banishes us up to his room. That woman was crazy. This is super long, and I haven't even touched on my mother-in-law. Mother-in-law story, please.
Story 2. When I met my husband's parents, I didn't know that the mom cooked with 0 spices. As in absolute 0, not even salt and pepper. So at our first meeting, a dinner at the parents' house, the food was so bland, no sauces, gravies, spices, or flavoring of any kind whatsoever. Their only condiment was ketchup, which I detest. The other family members drowned their food in it, except Mom. There was no reason for it. She just thought good food doesn't need seasoning. I struggled through the meal of a plain hamburger patty with plain mashed potatoes and some sort of vegetable mush. The following week, at Sunday dinner, I brought a small container of salt and pepper. When I discreetly tried to salt and pepper the plain baked potato, dead silence at the table and all eyes on me. I froze. The mother-in-law sniffed a tear back and left the table quickly. Dead silence while I waited for the floor to swallow me up. The husband-to-be reached over and picked up the tiny salt and pepper container and used it, passed it to his brother, who used it, and on around the table. Conversation resumed, and the mom quietly returned to the table, refusing to eat. Later, she was telling her son, my husband-to-be, that I obviously thought she was a dreadful cook, since good food did not require salt and pepper. To his ever-loving credit, he said, "Mom, you cook with love, but even good food needs a little seasoning." There was a reason I love this man. It took a lot to stand up to his mom, a very strong-minded woman. They never invited us to dinner again all the years we were married because I dared to put salt and pepper on food. Outside of this issue, we had a reasonable relationship. Not the greatest, but far from the worst. Story 3. My ex's mom was a narcissist who seemed to be in love with her son. Not in the cutesy, oh gosh, I'm just so in love with my little guy, normal mom way. Like, she clung on to him, guilt-tripping him into never abandoning her. And, she flirted with him. She prances around in her underwear in front of us a few times, doing this, oh, whoops, tee-hee act that squicked me the heck out. But that's another story. I had a very brief first encounter with her. He was still living at home because she'd throw a fit whenever he'd suggest he move out. She would end up alternating between insisting that she come along wherever he went — she was married, by the way — and guilt-tripping him by insisting he was a horrible, ungrateful son for even thinking of abandoning her. Anyway, he rushed me into his house and practically pushed me into his bedroom, and as he's closing the door, I see these fingers jam themselves between the door and the door frame, preventing him from closing it. I then proceeded to watch him shove his shoulder up against the door with all his weight as his mom desperately tries to claw her way into the room, trying to poke her head in, staring at me with this wild intensity and yelling, "Is this her? I want to meet her. Open the door. I want to meet her." As he yells back, "Yes, it's her. Go away, Mom. Mom, go away. Stop. No." Like, god dang, lady, no. I do not want to meet my new boyfriend's mother this way. This is not a great first impression. I'm scared. He finally manages to unwrap her fingers from around the door and shoves it closed. I hear her padding around outside in the hallway for a minute or two, and then she huffs and retreats to the den. I was then supposed to sleep with him. What a mood killer. My first real interaction with her was incredibly dramatic, but a bit less intense. I feel like I've written too much as is, so if anybody's curious, I'll tell you about that one. Story 4. First thing, she started quizzing my then-boyfriend about me in their native language, which she knew I spoke, but apparently didn't believe. She apparently thought I was underage. I was 26, and very stupid. In fairness, I probably did seem stupid, since I was just staring at her, dumbfounded, while she criticized my appearance and argued that I could not possibly be over 18. This somehow led into a weird scene where my ex disappeared while his mother demanded I try on clothes she'd gotten secondhand from people she knew, while debating, in English this time, how fat and unattractive I look in the ill-fitting, worn-out clothes. Then she made her 12-year-old son try on the same clothes and talked about how much better they looked on him and how it was a shame my hips were wider than his. I continued to look stupid, I'm sure, because now I'm dumbfounded by this woman wanting me to compete for her approval about how I look as compared to a 12-year-old boy. So at this point, I've realized she's just going to keep insulting and criticizing me, and yes, that continues through dinner. But the icing on the cake was when she started making racist comments about her own mixed-race kid, the same poor 12-year-old, and made him freaking dance, so we could all laugh at how stereotypical he was of people of his biological father's background. Then they all spent some time, in their native language, talking about how terrible and cheap Jews are, a pro of absolutely nothing. I'd like to say I spoke up, but I was supposed to stay at my ex's house until I found my own place, so I didn't. But man, in retrospect, and given the even weirder crap that happened after that, I really should have just sucked it up and paid for a hotel. Story 5. My first real relationship in high school dated a Polish junior. His parents moved to the US from Poland when he was little, and his mom was insanely protective of her first son. Met her after a few months, and we were taking a weekend trip to the beach with my family, so my parents wanted to meet him, etc. Pulled up to the house, and his dad was so nice to my family and me, and the mom came out screaming in Polish. She ranted and raved, threw a box of Marlboros all over my mom's face. We all got in the car and went to the shore, and my boyfriend was ticked off, but didn't seem like he was too surprised. We dated for a little over a year. During that time, his father was so nice to us, But the mom broke into his studio apartment, stole food we were going to make for dinner, and tossed all the cutlery and plates in the hall. His sister also punched him repeatedly when he asked why she did that. I found out the mom died a few years ago, and honestly was kind of happy. She was freaking miserable, and the dad didn't deserve to finish out his life with such a maniac. To clarify, the mom wasn't mentally ill. She was incredibly respectful and sweet to her sister's random hookups. She was protective of her son, and the sister just behaved like her. Also hit her boyfriends. Also, he has a studio apartment down the block in a house his dad owned. The dad moved him out because of how abusive his mom was to him. Story 6. Was dating a guy for about 3 months, and he was super weirdly close to his mom, and he told her everything. I was okay with this, because I'm very close to my mom, and I tell her a lot too. But apparently not as much as my ex told his mother, because the first time I ever met her, she politely pulled me aside to ask me about a bump in my hoo-ha her son had mentioned. She's a nurse, so he asked her for advice. She offered to check it out for me and make sure it's normal. I had no idea what bump she was talking about, so we called him because what the frick? First, describing my privates to his mom, then her trying to inspect me? The bump was on my cervix, guys. She was still weirdly close to him, and eventually he gave her my number and she would text me and call me just to check up on our relationship, asking me how we were doing, if we were being safe intimately. She never 100% believed I didn't have any weird diseases and that the bump he described really was my cervix, and I broke up with him not long after. Too long didn't read. X describes the inside of my cooter to his mom, tries to inspect it when I first meet her to make sure I'm clean, gets weirdly interested in our intimate life because she's convinced I'm going to give her son diseases. The bump is my cervix, and it's not contagious. I don't know, I think a cervix is genetic. 50-50 chance your kids will get one as well. Story 7. Made a throwaway just to post this. To this day, I haven't even told my boyfriend, since it's so embarrassing. I've actually never told anyone, except whatever stranger decides to read this. My boyfriend's mom is from out of town, so she flew in for a few days to visit him. I met up with the two of them and hung out. He then had to go to work, so I offered to show her around our city for the afternoon. We went to a store to shop around a bit. Around the time we were heading out the door, I had to pee really bad. The store, unfortunately, only had one restroom, and someone was taking their sweet time using it. I think you can see where this is going. I end up peeing my pants while waiting for the restroom. A little bit gets on the floor, and I'm panicking, so I spread it around the floor a little so it's not as obvious. I was in a panic. I go into the restroom to try to absorb some of my pee with toilet paper, and there was none left. I used the empty roll and tried to dab my pants as much as possible. I took my pants off and tried to air it out the best that I could. Luckily, I was wearing black pants, so I hoped to have some greater power above that she wouldn't notice. We had driven separately, so on the way to dinner, I had a towel in my car and sat on it to soak up the pee moisture. Throughout the entire meal, I was sitting in my pee-soaked pants. After dinner, she thanked me for hanging out with her and even gave me a hug. I probably smelled like pee, but she didn't say anything. I don't know if she noticed or told my boyfriend because he never said anything, and he's not the type to let me live this down. So, yeah, that happened. It wasn't the mom herself, but me. At least she told him she likes me, and every time she talks to him on the phone, she says to tell me hi. Everything you described has happened to me, with the exception of a mother-in-law. It's awful to have a bad bladder. I feel for you. Story 8. Dated a guy whose parents were from Guatemala. The ex was quite a bit shorter than me. He invites me to a family dinner, where I learn that he's the tall one in his family. Everybody speaks Spanish all night, which at the time I could not speak. His grandma, our host and cook, and a powerful matriarch, doesn't care. She just talks Spanish directly to me as if I can understand all night. The boyfriend translates sometimes, but not all the time.
Whenever he's not paying attention, I just smile and agree. Fast forward to the end of the night, and we're saying our goodbyes at the door. His grandma is basically as tall as my tooties, and when we are doing the customary cheek kiss goodbye, the family finds it funny. Somebody says, "Pick her up and spin her around." So I do. Turns out that was a joke. Story 9. That would be when I was 14 and had my first boyfriend. Went over to his house to hang out. His mother sat in the middle of the room, cross-legged, and played video games the whole time I was there, from about noon until 10:30 at night. She didn't move freaking once. Except for, of course, when my boyfriend's younger brother, probably 2 years old, asked his mom for juice or something. She responded by screaming at the toddler and slapping him across the face hard. Full freaking force. I couldn't believe it. Video game addiction can be a scary freaking thing. I started bringing candy and sugar to his little siblings. He had 5 of them, and being super nice to them, because their mother was, and probably still is, a crappy human being. Played video games the whole time I was there, screaming at the toddler and slapping him across the face. Oh, the opposite of freaking sweet. Story 10. When I met my boyfriend's mother, who only spoke Spanish, it was spur of the moment, so she hadn't known and hadn't had time to clean up. My boyfriend was translating for us and told me that she was embarrassed that the place was a mess. I was asking how to say she shouldn't be, thinking about all the cognates between English and Spanish, and vaguely remembering a word. I asked if the word was embarazada. Suddenly, his mom gasps and goes paler than the bedsheets, hands flying up to her mouth in horror. My boyfriend starts half talking, half crying in rapid-fire Spanish, seeming to practically plead with her or beg her as he literally falls to his knees. They talk, and she seems to calm down. Finally, my boyfriend turns to me and says, "No, embarazada is the word for pregnant." I would pay so much to witness this happen. Story 11. She turned to my significant other and said I had too much baggage and he shouldn't waste his time. Then she actively ignored me for the next several months. So much so that I'd say hi and she'd pointedly turn away. When she finally started interacting with me, she'd call me by his ex's name all the time. It took at least 2 years before she started turning around on things. She's still nuts in some ways, but we've managed to develop a healthy relationship. The crazy just comes in when I have to listen to her complain my significant other for not doing things like go to her friends' parties with her. She talks so loud, I hear every word over the phone. She doesn't try and BS with me, though, so I'm sure the tentative boundaries my significant other has been trying will work eventually. Just as my ever-since-the-beginning boundaries worked. She's not dumb, and you're never too old to learn. Story 12. My boyfriend's mom doesn't speak English, and we were going to stay with her for a week before Christmas. On the way to the airport, he told me that his mom actually doesn't know that we're coming because he wants to surprise her. How sweet. Except, for real, your mom should know a strange girl is coming to stay with her. I was so angry. When we get to her door, he rings the doorbell and jumps and hides behind the bushes. Before I realized what he had done, she opened the door and I'm just standing there alone. I probably looked like a Jehovah's Witness, come to talk to her about our Lord Jesus Christ. Talk about awkwardness. Story 13. This was back when I was in high school. My boyfriend and I had been dating for a few months, and he said that I should come over for dinner one night. He forewarned me about his mother, but I thought he was just trying to freak me out. Nope, not one bit. He was her oldest son and her baby. He looked at me as we were having dinner and said, "I belong to the ocean. Fernando is my son, and now is coming into his life and taking him away from me." I wanted to be a smart butt, but instead I kept my mouth shut. Every time she saw me, she glared at me, and I'm pretty sure she was planning my murder. Spent a good 5 seconds believing she told you she belongs to the ocean and was part of some sort of weird cult or something. Story 14. I knew my ex had a religious family, but didn't realize how religious until I met them. They were Pentecostal and prayed in tongues and channeled God. They were really, really into it. On my first day of meeting the parents, his mother took me to her friend's house, where her prayer group chanted over me after putting oil all over my body. I wasn't raised around such strangeness, so I felt very awkward, and I had to bite my lip to keep myself from breaking out into laughter. Mom was cool with me for a while, until God told her I had practiced witchcraft and practiced the dark arts. Once she had that in her head, the relationship was doomed. Doomed! We eventually broke up. Her son was super hot, but he thought fossils were the devil's trickery. He probably still thinks he dodged a witch. Story 15. My ex had prepared me for it, but his mom was just awful. Abused drugs and alcohol, and still played mean girl high school games at 50 plus. Very gossipy, flighty, and needy. First time we met, she looked super coked out and asked him for money, then started talking about how his younger sister was a dong sucker. In detail. The whole thing was uncomfortable. He was embarrassed and ashamed, and treated the whole situation and her with as much respect and kindness as I could. Gave him a lot of love and support after. He was a good guy, I just came from a tough situation. Oh, awesome, where does she live? She'll get along great with my mom. Story 16. Meeting my ex-boyfriend's mom, who lived in the house paid for by her husband, who was living in a McMansion with his mistress. Then finding out the mom had raised all of the kids until they were teens, when they all moved on up to the big house and left her there. It wasn't that she was bad, she was actually very nice. It was just a really messed up and awkward situation to be around, especially since she also raised her husband's mistress's 2 children, one of which was the same age as her youngest. Wow, that's sad. Story 17. My mother-in-law found us butt naked about to do it and lectured me for an hour about how Jesus says no. And then the next time she met me, she gave me STD pamphlets because I should get checked out, as I'm obviously a loose woman. Super great first meeting, and even better second meeting. Been with my husband over 10 years, and I'm still the witch that corrupted her precious son, and why he left her to move in with me when we decided to start a life together. Jesus says no. This is the part where you point out to her that neither one of you is Jesus. Story 18. I've one from the guy who met my mom. Mom decided that I was taking too long to introduce him to her, so without my knowledge, she went to his place of business, retail, went up to the most handsome white guy there and said, "You must be Jay." He pointed to my boyfriend in the back of the store. She walked up to the only other white guy in the store and assumed he was Jay. Once it was clear that Jay, the only guy left, was brown, she proceeded to explain that we used to live next to some Mexicans and they weren't very nice to their women. He said that he wasn't Mexican. She insisted there would still be cultural similarities. Jay isn't his real name, by the way. Holy crap. Story 19. I arrived at the house, and my ex's mother was sitting down in the living room. She didn't say hi, and he didn't introduce me, and just sat down. I literally stood there for a minute until she said, "Sit," because I was so awkward. After a while of watching TV, she started talking about how she hated his cousin's hair. The color didn't look good, and how she should dye it, and it doesn't look good at all. The cousin's hair was bright red, and so was freaking mine. For a hot sec, I thought you found out that you and your ex shared a cousin. Story 20. My ex's mom was a hippie, which was fine. I just was not expecting her to take her shirt off during our first meeting, and then get offended by me being uncomfortable. She then went on to tell me that her husband was a sex therapist in the 70s, and maybe I should have a few sessions with him to make me less uptight. One of the most awkward, uncomfortable nights of my life. This sounds like that scene from Meet the Parents. Story 21. I've only had 2 boyfriends, and both of the moms have been swell. The funniest was when I met my first boyfriend's parents. They are professional clowns. I rocked up to their house, and they both answered the door in full clown getup, makeup, costumes, and everything. It was great. Also, they are great clowns. The dad can breathe fire and juggle on-fire bowling pins on a 6-foot unicycle. Story 22. I had a long-term live-in boyfriend. We moved to Florida together, and I met his mother. She didn't speak English, which was understandable. They were from El Salvador. But then my boyfriend's father slapped her in the face while she cooked dinner during some kind of spat. Totally stopped the conversation and was like, "What the frick?" I was told to ignore it and that it was normal. I was 17 at the time, so I was pretty clueless. The relationship didn't work out because less than 3 months later, he started beating on me. Story 23. Dating a guy for a few months, go meet his mom, and she launches into the history of her abusive ex-husband and how, why, when he died. Kept going on and on about how she felt like a terrible parent because the guy wasn't successful. And on and on and on and on. And I don't really know what to say, so I'm just like, oh, and wow, and aw, because she isn't even letting me get a word in. Then I started noticing it in the guy I was dating and bailed ASAP. Story 24. I was 18, meeting my first ever boyfriend's mom for the first time. I didn't even get out my name before she shushed me, looked me up and down, left the room for a few seconds, then came back, handed me a box of condoms and said, "If you get pregnant, I'm not raising it. Don't make too much noise." Then, after an awkward silence, said, "Anyone ever told you that you look like a witch?" Well, I can assume that you don't look like Marcellus Wallace. Story 25. We drove 13-ish hours to visit his family. She went on a huge rant about how awful the gays are and that they all molest children. I thanked her for allowing someone she thought so lowly of to stay in her house because I am not straight and dated a woman for 5 years before her son. She tried to backpedal a lot after that. I don't know, but they always forget that the B in LGBTQ actually stands for something. Story 26. I met my high school boyfriend's mom at a football game. She left early because of a headache, and as she hugged me goodbye, she said, "He's a good one. You better marry him." She died of a brain aneurysm that night, and I did marry him, and he is a good one. Not cool, dude. That was, without warning, a direct shot. In all seriousness, I'm sorry for both of your losses, and glad her last words to you were so nice. Story 27. First boyfriend ever in 8th grade. I met his mom. She's fine. Then I go to meet his stepmom, who I had been told by him is a huge witch. She shakes my 13-year-old girl hand and makes small talk. Seems fine. Later on, she tells my boyfriend that she doesn't like me because I have a weak handshake. Again, I was a 13-year-old girl. Story 28. My mother-in-law now told me that my husband should have ended up with his ex-fiancée, but he messed it all up. Like, really? We are just meeting and you're telling me pretty much that you liked her more? She would still talk about seeing her around town for like months after we were together. It was always awkward, feeling second class to whoever this other woman was. Story 29. I had an ex-boyfriend whose mom wouldn't even meet me because she didn't like Hispanics. I never even met her, except for at her funeral 2 years later. She died from an aggressive form of brain cancer. Maybe not the worst, but certainly not how I wanted to meet her. You have an odd definition of meet, but I like it. Story 30. When I brought my girlfriend home for the first time, my mom took her aside and showed her all the patterns for baby clothing she had and said, "Someday I will make them for your kids." I can't believe she did not run away. In the end, it turns out my mom did make them for our kids. Story 31. My mom has always been, inappropriate. Somehow, since she felt awkward when she met my first boyfriend, she chose to initiate conversation with, "So, is my daughter good in bed?" Things were not less awkward. Story 32. She stared at me a bunch during dinner, never spoke, rarely even cracked a smile. The dad, on the other hand, wouldn't shut up. Then, as I left, she told me, "Do better." Story 33. When I met my ex-boyfriend's mother, one of the first things she said to me was, "Does he have a big dong like his daddy?" I was thoroughly creeped out.
Please leave your stories in the comments. I'd love to make a video of them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.